Harrenhal's towers rose like the fingers of a dead giant clawing at a pale spring sky, and the great lake of the God's Eye lay as a sheet of hammered steel, dull and inscrutable beneath the morning haze. The air smelled of trampled grass and horse, of spent torches and the sweet damp rot of the reed beds along the water. Canvas pavilions crowded the meadows, their colors bright as beetle wings in the dawn. Green and white, black and red, the sea blue of a storm-tossed house, the mustard and mud of lesser banners whose names most men would forget the moment they were furled. 1,000 small sounds braided together, the clink of bits, the low murmur of grooms, the cadence of someone whetting a blade, a hound shaking out wet ears, and beneath it all that moody susurrus that lakes make when they are thinking dark thoughts to themselves. Near the wooden quay thrust out into the rush-lined shallows stood a small man in a shirt the color of river moss, his hair damp and clinging to his brow. His boots were caked with clay to the ankle. He watched the gray-green water lap and recede as if listening for a voice that might speak only between the ripples. A little dragonfly skimmed past him, blue as a shard of sky. Howland Reed breathed it in, the lake, the reeds, the memory of a green island. Closing his eyes a moment against the press of tents and the weight of towers that were not made for Crannoc folk. The old gods do not love stone, Lyanna Stark had told him the night before, when she found him seated on a fallen trunk behind a stable, nursing a bruise given by boys with gilded spurs and too much wine. She had the smell of horse about her, the honest sharpness of it, and a laugh like a creek over pebbles. She had bound his wrist with her own kerchief, scolding and smiling in turns, then led him away to where the trees had not yet forgotten the speech of wind. Howland had felt young and old both at once, grateful and ashamed, and more than a little heartsick for the neck. Now the morning was colder than it had any right to be. He had dreamt of the Isle of Faces and woken with moss beneath his nails. He wondered if any of the green men watched the tourney from behind their leaves, and what judgments they might be making. Behind him feet crunched on the pebbled path. He turned and saw a boy with hair the color of a raven's wing and the stark look about the eyes. Benjen, the youngest wolf, with a pair of white apples in his hands, one of which he tossed over without asking if Howland were hungry. The apple was tart and good and pulled at his jaw. "Father wants us to keep out of the brawling today," Benjen said, speaking around his mouthful with the cheerful irreverence of the very young. "He says knights forget their courtesies after the first course of wine and the fifth tilt." Brandon laughed and said courtesies are a tent that collapses in a high wind. "I would not be too near the pavilions when they begin to blow." Benjen's grin faded as he studied Howland's face. "You were with Lyanna last night." "I was given kindness," Howland said. "It is a thing to remember when winter comes." "Lyanna is good," Benjen said fiercely, as if the lake might argue with him. "And she is fast. She climbs the broken stairs like a cat, and no stable master can tell her which horse to take. Brandon says she is too wild to wed." "He does not know anything." "Brothers do not always know the words their sisters carry," Howland said, though he was not sure why he said it, only that the shape of the truth pressed against his teeth until he let it pass. He thought of the dawn's light on a different place, a circle of white trunks old as first snowfall, of vows spoken in the hush of leaves. From the farther meadow came a bell's peal. It meant food for the lesser men and armor for the greater, meant the day's schedule was a boot on the neck of idleness. Benjen made a face, pitched his apple core into the reeds, and ran, shouting something about seeing if any squire would race him to the pens. Howland watched him go and then turned back to the lake. The dragonfly had gone, and the water gave up nothing. In a pavilion worked with 7-pointed stars embroidered painstakingly in pale silk, a prince drew the horsehair bow across a harp. The sound was thin in the chill air, but pure, and it seemed for a time that every line in the tent, rope, pole, woven curtain, leaned toward the music like a congregation leaning toward a beloved priest. Rhaegar Targaryen bent his head, and when the last note died he let the breath out of his lungs and looked at the ring upon his hand. Its metal was old, sly with the faint green of hidden copper. The gemstone was a disk of polished smoky quartz, the color of mist over water. A ribbon had been tied beneath the ring, no ornament fit for a prince, blue as winter sky, frayed at the edges. He turned it with his thumb and felt the river through it. Sir Arthur Dane stood by the tent flap, patient as dawn, his hands folded upon the belt from which dawn hung. He had a face that had been carved with a careful knife and eyes that had watched the desert until the desert had watched him back. If he was surprised to find himself at Harrenhal at the side of a man who had done a thing no prince had done in centuries, he did not show it. He had followed kings into folly and into wisdom both and understood that a sword cannot choose its season, only its service. "How many know?" Arthur asked, when the silence had stretched just far enough to be its own music. "The trees," Rhaegar said. "The green men, the old gods and new. A small man with a moss-colored shirt and a wound on his pride. A young woman who does not ask permission to be free." He smiled, almost. "You, the morning, the wind." Arthur's mouth corked once and then was steady again. "You did it." "I did it," Rhaegar said, and the words did not seem to belong to his own voice. He poured wine that he did not drink and placed the cup aside. "There is a constellated pattern set around my life. Since I was a child, I have listened for it in the harpstrings and in the auguries of fire. All my reading tells me the same tale, that to make the music whole, there must be not a single melody but a braid. The dragon has 3 heads. Your father would say that one is madness enough," Arthur said. He did not say your wife, and Rhaegar did not say her name, but he thought of Elia nevertheless. The way she smiled with exhaustion at her mouth's corners and the silk-soft weight of her hand in his and the physician's voice saying, "She has given you a daughter and will give you a son perhaps, if the gods are gentle. But not more. She was not fashioned to be a broodmare. You will be a widow sooner than you would ever wish if you press her." He had pressed no more, and in the quiet that followed the voice of the harp had grown louder, insistent as surf, speaking of northerly winds and old trees and a girl whose laughter melted ice. "The faith will not accept what I have done," Arthur said, as if reciting the first lesson of a sword dance. "Dorne will not forgive. Your father will call it treason. Lords will choose sides. Blood will hear the drum." "It hears it already," Rhaegar said softly. "What is a prince if not a man in a mask of inevitability? I have worn mine too long and hidden too much beneath it. Every counsel about how to step softly brims with the cost of stepping at all. And if I let the current carry me past this moment, I am lost to purpose." He traced the ribbon with his thumb. "I have made a marriage before the old gods. It is done." Arthur watched him for a time without moving. "Then let us be ready." "There is no readiness for truth," Rhaegar said. "Only the telling of it." Later, when the sun had burned through the haze and turned the world to brass and color, the lists were ringed with men and women, and the trumpets sent silver knives into the air. The stands creaked beneath the weight of lords and their hopes. House whence black bats hung upon yellow from every vantage. They had never looked so lively, as if the whole castle might take wing when the right cry came. Maesters entered wagers with the careful innocence of men who pretend that coin is a mere unit of curiosity. Bawds weighed their chances. Boys wore paper helmets and tilted with willow wands among the spectators while their mothers pretended not to notice. A hawker sold honeyed almonds and another watered bad wine. Hoster Tully's men sat not far from the stark bannermen. Somewhere in the pressing crowd, a delicate-faced girl with dark hair named Ashera Dane would laugh and make someone fall in love without meaning to. Lyanna Stark sat between Eddard and Brandon, her hair mostly tamed for once, a ribbon of blue at her throat. She had wrapped her hand in a linen strip that no one would remark upon, but she felt the memory of bark against her skin nonetheless. The gods had paid attention. When she thought of the morning, the white trunks with eyes, the presence under the leaves that was not a human presence, the way the words left her as if they had been waiting in her since birth, she felt both lighter and heavy, as if she had put down a pack too long carried and accidentally picked up a sword instead. "Robert will excel today," Brandon was saying with the brisk certainty of a man who saw the world as a series of contests he might win by charging. "He only needs to sit a horse and pick a straight line. He has the luck of thunder. Gods, but I would like to see him throw that hammer at some poor gilded cock with more pride than sense." Eddard, who thought before he spoke, said nothing. He watched Lyanna rather than the field and seemed to be counting something that only he knew to be countable. "I don't like gilded cocks either," Lyanna said idly, which made Benjen snort until Brandon cuffed him very lightly and told him not to be impertinent in front of ladies. Lyanna kicked Brandon's boot under the bench. Beyond them, Robert Baratheon stood among his friends, broad-shouldered and bright as a coin, tossing his head like a larger, more dangerous horse. He loosened his greaves with a laugh and made 3 different women blush in as many minutes and called for wine with a hand that never seemed empty. When his gaze passed across Lyanna, he grinned wide and careless and shook the sweat from his hair. She smiled back because it was expected and because she had loved him once in a way that was easy and uncomplicated, and because there was something magnificent in him even when she wanted to throw a bucket of cold lake water over his head. He smelled like spring and strength and not much else, which had always been both problem and promise. The first tilts began. Ser Jaime Lannister, hair like sunlight through ale, unhorsed a man whose name would fall out of history by supper. Ser Barristan Selmy, white as a wave, rode with the grace of an older song. The king, gaunt, sour-mouthed, his fingernails long as spite, sat glowering, flanked by the Lord Commander and by a man who had learned how to feed fear sweets until it forgot it was hungry. Aerys's expression was a knife that someone had not finished sharpening. He had not liked coming to Harrenhal. He had not liked the laughter he could not account for late at night, or the way the castle breathed in and out around him as if it did not need permission from its king. When Rhaegar entered the lists, a new sound climbed out of the crowd, not wholly a cheer. He wore no showy devices, only the 3-headed dragon, and the silk of his surcoat seemed to darken in the subtle way that shadow deepens under a full moon. His horse was a gray flecked with the scant brightness of river stones in sun. He saluted the stands, and his gaze, passing across the world, snagged for a fraction of a heartbeat on the stark benches before moving on. He won and won again, not with the brutality that delighted the coarse-hearted but with the precision that makes even enemies draw a breath of unwilling admiration. He broke lances neatly, rode the line as if he had drawn it himself, and when the list steward called out his victories, the afternoon applauded as if it knew the shape of what was coming and could not help but clap for craft. He crowned no queen of love and beauty then. That would be later. At sunset, the lake drank gold from the sky and gave back only a stern, unlovely gleam. Torches were set. Musicians warmed their fingers and their airs with minor keys. The great hall of Harrenhal was a vast ribcage of stone filled with breath and sound. Tables bent under the wealth of a fertile, peaceful realm. Silver trout glazed in wine, turned joints of beef, trenches of stewed roots, wheels of cheese sweating faintly in the heat, loaves with crusts like armor. There was a particular buzz around the dais, the sort of anticipatory itch that attends important households when those households have brought their secrets to supper. Lyanna ate little and drank less. She looked at the long hall and tried to see it as it would be remembered 30 years from now when all the keen faces had grown dull or gone into the dirt. The bat banners stirring as if they itched, the king's eyes glittering like bad glass, the way all sound seemed to gather in the cup of the prince's palm when he touched the harp-strings near his elbow. She thought of snow falling silently into woods where no man trod. She thought of a dawn so white it made your teeth ache. Rhaegar stood. He did not need to speak loud. The hall went quiet in a way that resembled reverence but could equally well have been alarm. "My lords and ladies," he said, and the gentle cadence of his voice betrayed his years spent with song more than with command. "My father's kingly hospitality has brought us together to watch deeds of arms and to strengthen the ties that keep our realm from breaking when the year turns hard. You have seen men ride in glory and in folly both, and you have laughed and gasped and shouted as all the world does when a lance meets its moment. I would speak to a different kind of meeting." Aerys shifted on his chair like a man with an itch he had been told not to scratch. Varys leaned a fraction, like a flower toward a sun no one else could see. Gerald Hightower's mouth tightened nearly imperceptibly. Rhaegar continued, "We are bound by many customs. Some were born in the grass and the cold of the north, under eyes that look out from bark. Some were born where 7 are 1 and mercy is a book. Some are older than either. When the old ways and the new ways speak together, there is often discord, but sometimes there is a harmony that is scarcely audible and yet truer than either alone. Brandon Stark half rose, then sat again with a visible effort, his jaw working as if to grind down his own rashness. Eddard's hand was on his sleeve without his looking. Rhaegar raised his left hand and the smoky quartz ring caught the light. "I have married in the sight of the old gods," he said. The words fell like a smith's hammer on an anvil. "On the Isle of Faces, whose trees remember what iron and oaths forget. My wife is Lyanna Stark." The silence that followed was not empty. It was crowded with the sudden press of 1,000 separate thoughts, a flock of birds all winging upward at once so that the air fills with the insolent thunder of their going. Someone at the rear dropped a trencher and it clattered like a cut chain. The king's fingers curled on the arm of his chair, and the nail of one blackened index finger made a small tick against the wood. Robert Baratheon made a sound halfway between a laugh and a snarl and then strangled it into nothing. Rhaegar did not lower his hand. "I say this not to shame any house, nor to spurn any vows made under the seven. My wife Elia is dear to me for her gentleness and for the children she has given me, and I honor her as I honor Dorne. But I am a prince of the blood of Valyria, and our histories are not like yours. The kings who made this realm rode with more than one wife beside them, and the faith learned to endure it, for the sake of peace and of a greater purpose. I ask that we remember that endurance now. I ask that my vows to Lyanna be recognized. I ask that the realm be brave enough to believe that its future is not a cramped corridor where only one truth may pass at a time." The hall's breath returned in a ragged wave. Men were on their feet and sitting again, heads together like conspiracies, like prayers. Oberyn Martell was not present, but if he had been, he would have smiled too broadly and too thinly at once. Hoster Tully's face went red and pale by turns. Somewhere a Septon muttered a frantic version of the mother's prayer with his lips white. Someone laughed horribly. Someone cried. The sounds braided and unbraided, made and unmade sense. Lyanna had not looked down. She did not look away now. She felt herself watched as prey and as miracle both. She had chosen. She would choose again if the dawn replayed itself. Aerys rose. He stood as a man stands who has been struck in his sleep and does not know yet who has struck him. He looked thin and old and fierce. His voice, when it started, rasped like a flint on a wet wick. "You usurp," he said. He did not say "my son." "You usurp the faith and the throne and the rights of lords and all the things that make men different from wolves. You shame your wife. You shame this house. You shame me." His tongue flicked across cracked lips. He lifted a trembling hand and pointed it. "Kingsguard," he said. "Seize the girl. Seize the northern girl. Seize any man who draws a sword to stop you." Arthur Dayne did not move. Oswell Went did not move. The White Bull did not move. Barristan Selmy's eyes went to the prince. Not to ask, not to wait for an order the prince had no right to give, but in the old habit that had been cut into him by service, to warn, perhaps, or to measure. It was not simply fear that held them. There was in the air that sense of having stepped upon a plank over water without testing it first. Brandon Stark was already moving. He came like a fire cutting across stubble, and if Eddard had not caught him by the shoulder with surprising quickness, Brandon would have been upon the dais with both hands and his teeth to follow. "Come out and die!" he shouted, and there was something almost grateful in his shout, as if he had been waiting for words worth the weight of his voice. The hall erupted. Steel drawn, curses, benches thrown aside, and then it paused again because Rhaegar had raised his hand a second time, and in that hand was not a weapon but his harp. He drew the bow across the strings once only. The sound went out and seemed to snuff some small part of the fire that had just caught. It was not magic. It was only the memory of music that most in the hall shared with him. The old long nights where a song had taught them to keep their knives put away. Aerys's mouth twisted with disgust. "I will not let you take her," Rhaegar said, quiet. "You may kill me and make your kingship out of the body of your heir, but you will not take her, father." Father came out like a stone thrown into shallow water and did not sink as deeply as it should have. "Then I will take the wolf's father," Aerys hissed. "I will take the wolf's brother." I will take wolves until I have a coat again." "Your Grace," said Gerald Hightower, and his voice had the weary patience of an old man explaining snow to a child. "Here is not a court. Here is a hall. There are too many swords and no sufficient evidence and daylight yet left to be wasted. Let Lord Rhaegar answer for his house in the capital. Let the law be the law in the place where law is kept. The law is where I am," Aerys said. But he sank into his seat again like a man sitting on the edge of a well to listen for something that might be coming up at him. "Bring me Brandon Stark," he said. "Bring me the father. Bind them with words. Let them walk to me in fetters of their pride. Seize the Northmen who toss tables and shout and make noise. This is a celebration," Oswell said, with the doomed, dogged cheerfulness of a man trying to make a barrel of beer do the work of a warehouse. "Let it be one. Let us drink to His Highness's victory on the field. Let us taste the Tully trout. Let us breathe." "A feast of traitors," Aerys said, soft as the edge of a sword, but he did not begin ordering throats cut on the benches. He had learned, in some corner of himself that was not holy wreckage, that such work was better done in rooms with walls closer together. Slowly, as if a wrangler calming a team of mules, the evening was coaxed toward something like normal. People spoke, but too much of their talk was whispering. People ate, but little of it tasted like anything. The musicians played but missed notes. The king's fingers ticked against wood and did not stop, though sometimes they sped up and sometimes they were still for longer than breath. Robert Baratheon left, his jaw set, his knuckles pale. Eddard went after him. Benjen sat and said nothing and then fell asleep upright, his head on Lyanna's shoulder as if he were still small. Brandon found another outlet for his body in the wrestling circle behind the kitchens and used it until the other men stopped wanting to wrestle with him. The night became porous and let things through it that daylight had kept back. Rhaegar did not approach Lyanna at table, but when the singers packed up and the torches hissed lower and the floor had become a garden of spilled drink and crushed bread, he sent Arthur to her. He came himself then, not with any pomp, only with that careful way of walking that made it seem he could be quiet even on stone. "Will you come outside?" he asked, as if he were asking something so small a child might be trusted with it. They walked along a cloister where the air smelled of mint and mouse. Crickets sawed. Far off, the lake made that sound again of thinking. He did not take her hand. They had had enough of hands in the morning. "Your father will not forget this night," Lyanna said. "He has forgotten what is worth remembering," Rhaegar said. "What he remembers is the key to a door that opens into nothing." "Robert will not forget," she said. "He was not made to forget," Rhaegar admitted. "He was made to break and to love. In better years a man like him would rule a storm and keep his friends drunk and happy and die laughing. But he lives in the years we were given." "And Elia," Lyanna said quietly, the name that made a hinge out of the night. He felt it like a small cut where he had expected a blow. "I will not lie to you. I have not loved many people in a way that is not difficult. But I loved her gently, and she deserved gentleness without the iron behind it that I always seem to have. I will not let the realm eat her because of what I have done." "It may try," Lyanna said. "It has a mouth like a maw. Then I will break teeth against it," he said without heat, as if stating the number of steps between where they stood and the archway. He looked toward the black water of the God's Eye. His voice turned and looked elsewhere. "I see patterns, Lyanna, scales and notes. There is a cold in the north that is not merely winter, and there is a fire that is not merely summer, and I think our children may be born to stand where those things meet. They will not thank us for it, but perhaps they will be alive to be ungrateful." She smiled, not because it was a good jest. "My father will want to speak with you." "I will go to him," he said. "If he will not receive me, I will wait until he does. I will not steal you. That would stain what we have done worse than any king's judgment." "You already have stolen me," she said, a wolf's grin freeing itself for a heartbeat. "But I went along laughing. In the morning ravens flew like bad luck. Harrenhal's rookery disgorged them, and every bannerman's boy with a strong arm and a decent perch sent one skyward, so that the air filled with black scraps and voices. Ares called for parchment and set the ink too thick in the nib and scratched writs that looked as if a spider were trying to climb out from under the quill. He sent for Lord Rhaegar Stark and bid him come to King's Landing to answer for the conduct of his son and the presumption of his daughter. He commanded that Brandon be arrested for issuing challenge in the king's presence and for disturbing the king's peace. He told the maesters to write the faith to remind them that their limits were the limits the Iron Throne had set, and that if they preached sedition from their pulpits, he would have those pulpits pulled down stone by stone and used to pave roads to gallows. He spoke the name of Tywin Lannister twice and spat after it without much conviction. When the spittle dried, he complained that the floors were not being cleaned with enough oil. Lord Rhaegar, upon receiving his son's report and the prince's undeniably public words, did not rage. He had never been a man for that kind of noise. He dressed as if for court. He set words in a carefully ordered array. He brought Eddard and Benjen and sat with them and said, "We will go to speak with the prince." Brandon paced like a caged cat. He would have broken bars if someone had given him bars. Lyanna stood by the embrasure and looked out at the lake and wondered what the green men saw when they looked at men and whether it amused or saddened them to be so necessary to their ceremonies and so excluded from their certainties. Rhaegar received Lord Rhaegar Stark in a smaller hall whose window faced east and made a virtue of the sun by letting it in. Arthur stood behind him at an angle that could have been pure formality and could have been, to a knowing eye, a place from which to stop a blade. When Rhaegar came in, he bowed no lower than courtesy required and no lower than pride could bear without cracking. "Your Highness," he said. "My lord," Rhaegar said. He looked at Eddard and Benjen and then at Brandon, who could not keep his hands still for more than a count of 5. He looked last at Lyanna, not as a man looks at a possession, nor yet at a miracle, but as a man looks at the thing he has chosen to have weigh upon him for the rest of his life. "The matter is simple," Rhaegar said. "You announced a marriage. My daughter is betrothed to Lord Robert Baratheon by arrangement between our houses witnessed by the gods and the men who speak for them. You ask us to declare that betrothal null. You ask us to recognize a marriage done under trees on an island whose laws belong to a time when wolves had better manners than men. You ask this of me as a father and of me as Lord of Winterfell. Speak, then, if you think words can make a bridge where everyone else sees water." Rhaegar nodded once, the smallest of acknowledgments for a man walking where he had chosen to place his foot. "I do not ask you to consent to what has already been done. Consent is for gates and the horse has gone through. I ask you to accept that I will stand in the light with it rather than skulk in shadows. Your daughter chose as freely as I did. If I had intended to use her and put her aside when the madness of song had passed, you would be justified in cutting me down here at your leisure. That is not my meaning and not my intention. I will make it so the realm will have to be blind to deny it." Brandon made a sound like a blade drawn against bone. Eddard's hand did not need to rise to still him now. Something in the room did it instead. Ricard's face moved not at all, but his eyes did, a small narrowing as if to bring the prince into sharper focus. "Words weigh more when carried by deeds," he said. "You speak of standing in the light. Very well. Tell me your road. Tell me the first 3 steps you would take." "First," Rhaegar said, "I will send to the High Septon and to the most devout with history and precedent and with men who can quote them better than I can. They will refuse to recognize a polygamous union, but they cannot easily refuse to recognize a marriage under the old gods among those who keep them, and we will make the question that one rather than the other whenever possible. Second, I will send to Tourn with apology and with honor and with the assurance that Elia remains princess and her children my heirs as the law has made them. I will go myself if I may. I will make visible that I am not discarding their daughter like a worn shoe. Third, I will form a council, not of flatterers, but of those who will stand between my father and destruction if they can. If the realm sees a prince who has married unwisely, they will call me rash. If they see a prince who has married and then governed well, they may call me something else. And my house, Ricard asked, mild as winter sun. What do you ask of us? Apart from that, we not flay you and hang your skin on the Harrenhal gate. Come with me into daylight, Rhaegar said. Fight whoever calls this an abduction. We will not give them that word. We will not give them that lie. Come with me, and when the storm breaks, and it will, you will have my oath that if the throne passes to me while life still plays the knife between my father's ribs, you shall have a king who remembers that wolves kept him from freezing. Rhaegar was quiet a long time. Then he said, Brandon. Brandon had not expected to be called upon. He made a visible effort to gather his thoughts and then did not gather them so much as decide to lay down the ones that were swords and keep those that were stones. I think this is folly, he said, and I think we have been given the choice to make our folly stand next to yours and bow to it or spit at it. I choose to spit. He looked at Lyanna and the whole front of his face changed old in an instant. But I will not take a knife to my sister's throat to save her from a wound she has chosen. I will not be the one who calls her taken if she says she went. If the king calls us to court, we go. If he calls us criminals, we see what law weighs more, the law of his mouth or the law that men remember 1,000 years after a mouth is earth. Rhaegar turned to Eddard. Eddard said, I cannot pretend to wisdom. I know only that there are some things you cannot do secretly without becoming the sort of man who needs secrecy to live. The prince has done a bold thing boldly. I do not know if that makes it right. I know only that I have loved my sister all my life and she has always chosen the windward path. I will walk it with her as far as I can. Rhaegar looked at Lyanna last. Daughter, he said. She felt the word enter her like a thread passes a needle's eye. I stood before trees and spoke a vow, she said. I am not a thing to be traded. If this is madness, at least it is my madness. I have no taste for being sane in rooms where men have decided a woman's silence is the tax they levy upon her life. Rhaegar's breath came out, not quite a sigh. Then we will write to Lord Arryn, he said to the room more than to the prince, and to Lord Robert, and to those who will need their letters uncorked like wine to make them drink what we must swallow. We will go to King's Landing when the king calls. We will keep a hold on our words until there is nothing else for them to hold. After the Starks had gone, Rhaegar stood very still with his hands at his sides and the ring pressing into his palm. Arthur said nothing for a long while. When he did, it was in that dry Dornish way that made a witticism sound like a prayer. You promise a great deal. I will keep every promise I am given time to keep, Rhaegar said. Time is a sword, Arthur said. It cuts men away from their intentions. Then let us learn to parry, Rhaegar said, and allowed himself, for the first time since the words in the hall, to close his eyes. In the days that followed, the tourney contented itself with the business of sport and the rumor of war. Men fell and rose and were celebrated and then forgotten, which is how the songs prefer things to be. The Knight of the Laughing Tree did not appear to shame ill-mannered squires in these tellings. That had been a story for the earlier knights, and its echoes now took strange new forms, as such stories do, attaching themselves to other deeds like burrs to trouser legs. Ares remained within stone, complaining of drafts, demanding charcoal even as the days warmed, asking who had laughed outside his door and why, and whether the cooks were hiding blades in the pies, and if so, whether the blades were clean. Letters crossed the sky like migrating flocks. In Storm's End, they landed on a table sticky with the syrup of pears and left Robert Baratheon with both fists flat against rough wood. His mouth bent, his eyes not drunken at all. In the Eyrie, they came to Jon Arryn, who rubbed his thumb along the crease of one parchment with the expression of a man feeling for a crack in a dam. In Sunspear, they were handed to a prince who moved less than he thought, and in the moving of his eyebrows only a fraction betrayed the calculation that took wing and returned with thorns in its beak. In King's Landing, the ravens settled with their ragged dignity, and the Septon counted his rosary, and the Goldcloaks told jokes about wolves that had wandered into a lion's den wearing silk and a smile and found the lion asleep. On the last afternoon, as the tents were being struck in an agitation of colored cloth and exasperated curses, as the grate emptied itself into smaller, traveling households again, Lyanna took a horse and rode alone along the lake's edge until the cattails gave her a green privacy. She dismounted and let the horse graze and then sat with her boots off and her feet in the water and thought of winter. It would come, and it would find her whether in a tower of stone or on a hill of dirt. whether she hid in a grove of white trees or walked into court with her head bare. It would come, and she could not be like women who built their homes beneath eaves so long that snow could not touch their hair. She heard him before she saw him, the wasted song of the harp without the bow, only the plucked strings, tentative as a question asked for the first time. He came and did not sit without looking at her to see if sitting would be permitted, which made her want to laugh and cry at once. He had a way of making room around himself, even in a space as wide as a lake. "When we were children," Lyanna said, because no one had asked a question yet and the silence was too full. "Brandon and I ran along the walls at Winterfell, daring each other to walk the narrower courses. I thought I was fearless. Then the wind rose, and I discovered there are braver things than going forward when the stone is wide and the air gentle." "Do you wish to step down?" he asked. "No," she said, surprised to find how true it was. "I only wish the wind would say what it wants rather than merely push. It wants to tell us stories older than words," he said. "It is bad at it, and so it shoves." He looked out over the water. "We will go from here to King's Landing. We will go because we must, and because the road is sometimes the only thing men will accept as a judge. In the capital my father will do new harm, perhaps to us, perhaps to himself. I cannot promise you safety. I can only promise you that I will not run." She slid her feet out of the water and stood and went barefoot a few steps, feeling the mud's cool clutch and release. "You were a boy in the Red Keep," she said, as if telling him something he did not know. "You learned to play the harp there and learned that songs can summon men's better selves. There are men in that city who have none. Do you understand this?" "I do," he said, and his voice wore age like a mantle. "And yet I believe this is the only way to make what we did not a theft." She took his hand then, because she wanted the feel of it when she was later called to remember. The skin was not soft. It was surprising and then not. "Very well, Your Highness," she said. "Let us walk into the lion's den and see if the cases we are bring are worth the scratches we will get." He smiled without showing his teeth and looked down and for a moment seemed the young man who had once read books in corners while other boys learned to thrust with wooden swords. "It is not the lions I fear," he said. "Lions are honest in their way. It is the cats who have learned how to steal milk without making the cream ripple." She laughed then, and the sound went across the reeds and out over the water and might have reached the isle if anything in the world could be so obliging. The horse lifted its head and whickered and then went back to grazing. Far away, banners came down and folded like tired birds. The sun dragged slow as a reluctant witness toward an hour that would carry them all into darker rooms, where men would pretend that decisions are made and not merely discovered. Night found Harrenhal half dismantled. The field looked as if bright mushrooms had sprung up and then been harvested by an impatient, clumsy hand. Fires coiled from cookpits and leaned toward each other like men swapping secrets. In the king's chamber, Aerys spoke to no one for an hour and then to Varys for 3, after which he wept briefly in a way that frightened the eunuch, who had an unfeigned horror of wasted liquids. In the Went kitchens, a girl with flour on her face spun a tale about a knight who had kissed her by the barrels. Not a true tale, but one that would be remembered and borrowed by others until it congealed into truth. On the lake, the first spring gnats found each other and commenced their brief ecstasies. In the Stark camp, Rhaegar Stark wrote by lamplight with a hand that required no blotter. He put down Lord Arryn's name with the same calm with which he would have put down the word winter. Brandon slept, thrown across the bed as if he had been dropped there by a giant annoyed to find him still alive. Benjen breathed the deep, untroubled breath of the young. Eddard lay awake and counted the beats of his heart and thought of the taste of iron and of snow and of a boyhood friend in the Vale who had taught him how to use patience as if it were a knife. Lyanna dreamt of trees with faces and woke with the taste of iron in her mouth and could not say whether it was blood or the tang of the lake. She sat up and listened for the first sounds of a house breaking camp. They had not yet begun. She could hear only the horses shifting and the cadence of a watchman's step. She rose, pulled on a cloak, and slipped out into the corridor. She did not look to see who might see her. She had borne enough witness for one day to answer any who might question this small trespass. He was in the cloister again, alone this time, his harp asleep beside him. He turned when she approached and did not speak. They did not need more words just then. She sat beside him, and they watched a moth beat itself senseless against a candle flame until it learned enough humility to retreat and make do with the moon. In the quiet of that hour, it seemed possible that what they had done might be part of a story that led to something other than the sword. The air was soft. The breath of the lake had turned warmer. Somewhere a pair of cats made their filthy catechism. Somewhere a guard yawned and nearly set his halberd clattering and managed to catch it in time and felt absurdly proud. The old gods, if they watched, did so without peeking. The new gods, if they judged, did so without yet punishing. Later there would be roads. There would be gates that opened and did not open. There would be a hall made of red stone where a father tried to prove that law could be bent so far it would hold a man to his death like a trap. There would be a tower in a dry land where 3 men waited with white cloaks and older vows and did not know what sort of knock they would hear upon their door. There would be a throne made of dead men's swords and a prince who had never wanted to sit on it, and a realm that would decide for itself what it loved more, its habits or its hopes. But for a handful of minutes at the end of a day that had refused to be only a day, the world held its breath with them and made no demand that they be anything other than 2 people who had said a thing and meant it. When the dawn came, it was not loud. It put pale fingers between the battlements and found where their cheeks had been pressed to the cool stone and warmed those places the way a mother warms bread with her hands. The first raven coughed in its throat and then remembered its business and opened its beak, and the sky took what it was given. The Tourney field was a skeleton waiting to be buried. Men woke and swore and laughed and coughed and laughed and swore again. Somewhere a horse kicked a plank loose and ran with it dangling at its hock until 3 grooms brought it back with soft words and a piece of carrot. Lyanna stood and looked at the lake one last time, as if it were a friend she would not see again for many years. Rhaegar rose beside her and picked up his harp with a hand that would have been equally comfortable with a sword. They did not touch, not because they were ashamed, but because they had touched already where it mattered and would again where it mattered next. They walked back toward the pavilions in companionable silence. The wind had no new stories to tell them but nudged them along anyway, like an old aunt who knows the road better than you but does not insist upon it. Their households moved. Harrenhal sank back into its own shadow, counting itself lucky not to have been asked to carry more of this tale than it already had. The king's litter and riders went one way, the wolves another. The dragon's banner turned toward the river road that would take it to a city misnamed for kindness. The lake watched them go and did not offer counsel. On the Isle of Faces, the leaves did whatever it is leaves do when men are not there to claim they choose it for them. The morning gathered itself into the rhythm of hooves and iron wheels on ruts and the soft moan of leather stretching. Any passerby would have seen a great household in motion at the end of a great event. Any passerby could have been forgiven for thinking that such things always ended this way, with packing and tallying and a last loaf wrapped in cloth for the road. The passerby would have been right in a sense, and wrong in the only way that matters. A song began in Rhaegar's head as they took the road. It was not one he had written before, though he recognized some of its shape. It had the cold in it and the heat and the sound of bees in summer and a blade striking ice. It had courage and stupidity and the way men look at a woman they cannot own and the way women look back when they are done with being told they belong to anything but themselves. He did not play it. He listened. It would be time enough for playing when the road ran out and the doors shut behind them and the voices began to weigh their lives. Lyanna rode with her face set forward and a strand of hair come loose to trip across her cheek. And when Eddard looked at her, he saw not a sister he could keep safe but a person he could walk beside. Brandon rode elsewhere, choosing not to speak because his mouth had nothing to say that would not set fire to something that the rain could not easily douse. Benjen hummed an obscene song learned from squires and pretended innocence when Ricard glanced at him. Ricard counted hawks in the sky and knew each one for what kind it was and wondered, privately, how long the wings we grow in youth keep us aloft when the air thins. At a turning of the road, when the trees leaned in and tried to eavesdrop, Rhaegar drew closer to Lyanna and said very softly, "When we come to the city, I will ask you to be braver than men have the right to ask women to be. When you tire, rest. When you need to rail, rail. When you wish to run, tell me, and I will run with you until the end of the world or until the world gives us permission to stop. You have my word." She nodded once. It was not the nod of a lady to a prince. It was the nod of a rider to another rider, acknowledging a hard road and a horse with sense enough to carry them both. Then she put her heels to her mare and took the lead for a dozen heartbeats. And he let her, and the men around them, measuring as men do, found themselves measuring something they had not known to account for 2 days ago. By mid-morning, Harrenhal's bats were hiding their faces from the day, and the lake, freed of its bright burdens, went back to being itself. The wind grew bored and went to find trouble in the skirts of merchants' wives. The road lengthened and narrowed and lengthened again, a ribbon someone had dropped and forgotten to retrieve. The story followed, obedient for now, and waited to see what sort of room would be made for it in a city that had no patience left for stories unless they ended with a head on a spike and the promise that such things made other things safer. The sun rose another inch in the sky. The horses breathed in and out. The banners lifted and fell. Somewhere far to the north a raven saw snow, and somewhere farther to the south a snake tasted dust and smiled. In between, the prince and the wolf girl rode into the uncertain light, and the world, which is slow to change and quick to punish, thought about it. The road bent toward the river and away again, a ribbon laid down by a hand that had not cared for maps so much as for the way water speaks to land. On days when the clouds scud low, the banners hung heavy and the cloth took on the dullness of soaked wool. On clearer hours, the three-headed dragon caught sun and tossed it about as if playing with bright fish. Small folk stood to watch, mud on their hems, hands to cheeks, children craning to see a prince, and a girl whispered of as if she were wind. They said all the things small folk say when a story begins to ripple the skin of the world. That he was a sorcerer and had bewitched a maid, that she had bewitched him, that no one bewitches a wolf in lives, that Dornish women are witches already and have no cause to fear more, that the king had gone mad from sleeping on blades shaped like oaths and that words had begun to cut him where his armor could not reach, that the old gods had reached out leafy hands and taken back something kings had thought theirs to a lot. Sometimes a woman would call to them, not boldly but not shrinking either, and press a sprig of something against the prince's boot. Rosemary for remembrance, a twist of flax for binding, a bit of dried apple because mothers have always believed that if they feed a traveler he will remember to come home to someone. Lyanna would lift her hand in acknowledgement and not lower her eyes, and that too was a kind of food, though not the kind that fills bellies. Boys ran alongside until the grooms shouted and they fell back, breathless and triumphant because dust on the tongue can taste like glory if you think you are part of it. At midday they stopped where a stand of oaks made a cathedral of light. The household went about the business of feeding men and beasts. The Stark men brought out salted fish and hard bread. The prince's men brought out soft cheese and a pot of stewed chickpeas spiced and yellow as sunlight. They shared and pretended not to notice they were sharing. Benjen dazzled boys from both camps by juggling 3 apples and dropping one to the laughter of men drawn to any clatter that does not mean a blade. Brandon challenged a man to arm wrestling and lost the first bout deliberately and the second by accident and the third by refusing to cheat. He laughed and slapped his opponent's back until the man limped a little when he rose. Eddard sat with the ledgers and pretended to help the quartermaster and discovered there is a peace in numbers that men mistrust until they must make a long march. Ricard wrote, as he did every day, his hand steady even on rough ground. Rhaegar sat upon a fallen log and tuned his harp until the strings stopped sounding like wire and began sounding like voice. He kept his eyes upon his hands so that no one would feel looked at who wished to listen without being seen. He played no song that small folk might seize and carry ahead of him like a fanfare. He played the low music that undergirds melody, the slow foundations upon which braver notes can stand. It was a way of telling the air that he knew this moment for what it was and did not intend to make it feel like pageantry. By the end of it, the men were quieter, and the horses pricked their ears and then returned to their grazing, and a girl with a smear of grease on her cheek leaned her head against her mother's skirt and slept. When they came to river crossings, ferrymen leaned on poles and watched like magistrates as carts rolled on and rolled off and set the day to wobbling for a moment before it found its footing again. At inns, the innkeepers' wives looked at Lyanna with the frankness of women whose work leaves no time for lies to put on their best dress. Some of them smiled in a way that said daughters do not belong to fathers as much as fathers like to think. Others frowned in the way of women who measure danger like flour. In any group of people there are always those who make a weighing and those who make a story. The weighing went on quietly while the stories shouted about queens and wolves. The weighing mattered more. At storm's end the wind threw itself against the walls with such force the stone seemed to hunch its shoulders and take the blows like a tired boxer. In its great hall, where the tables were scarred by knives and by the hot bottoms of pots, Robert Baratheon paced like a caged bear. He had dismissed his men because if he barked at them one more time one of them would bark back and then there would be blood, and he was sick to the back teeth of blood without purpose. He had drunk some and stopped himself and drank water with fury, as if it were a poor wine that had insulted him by pretending to be more than it was. Stannis sat in a chair that would have been too high for most men and made him look like a judge in a play. He had a book on his knee and was not reading it. Renly, a child, was nowhere that either brother could see him, which meant he was in the kitchens, which meant he was not where he might be yelled at. "She is mine," Robert said to the heir, which had heard this declaration 4 times already that morning and 6 times the night before. "By vow, they said the words. I said the words. He cannot come in his silks and his harp and take her like. He could not find what it would be like. All the things he had to compare were simpler and harder, metal against bone, a shout and then the shield rising by its own will." He shook his head as if to clear water from his ears. He cannot. Stannis's mouth did something that might have been the ghost of pity. "He has," he said. "The question is what we do after we have established that he has." "I ride," Robert said. "I ride and I smash him and then I take." He stopped. The stone received the unspoken word and cooled it and handed it back to him less appetizing. He gestured at the air, furious with it for refusing to be punched. "The world used to make sense," he muttered. Stannis looked at him levelly. "It has never made sense," he said. "Sometimes our place in the nonsense is to endure it without flinching." Robert laughed. It was a bad laugh, too loud for a room that had not consented to laughter yet. "And sometimes the nonsense can be beaten into sense," he said. "Ask the men who follow me." "I might ask the men who follow a king," Stannis said. "If you strike a prince you strike the road that leads to the throne. The faith will not be on your side. The north may be and your friend with it. There will be no half measure. If you cannot stomach that now, do not begin pretending you can." Robert slammed his palm upon the table. Plums rolled and one fell and burst upon the floor with a little sound like the last insult of a ruined man. He stood in the mess and did not notice. His eyes were bright with a kind of hurt that would not admit itself as such. "I loved her," he said, and there was a boy in the word, stout and quick and delighted. "And she laughed at me as if I was a thunderhead on a hill that only scared the sheep." Stannis leaned forward, his hand upon the book's cover as if to keep it from taking flight. "You loved the girl you told yourself she was," he said. "Find the difference and then perhaps we can speak of war with a clean tongue." Robert looked as if he might hit him. He did not. He looked as if he might cry. He did not do that either. He grabbed a cup and drank water as if drowning were preferable. In the Eyrie, Jon Arryn stood by a window where the wind made a particular sound each hour as the sun moved, a whistle that taught patient men how to tell time by music. He held the Stark letter. He let his thumb find the groove the pen had left and thought of Eddard as a boy, silent and kind-eyed, always standing a little back in a room as if to make space for someone who might need it more. He thought of Robert as a young bear who had not yet learned the limits of his own strength and so broke things he would have preferred to hold. He thought of the realm as a mechanism with too many gears, all of which had become slightly misaligned. He had spent his life reaching into such machines to click things into place with a turn of his wrist. More and more often of late the machine bit him. 80 years ago, he said to the window, this would have been a thing the faith could be made to swallow with enough honey and enough threat. He smiled at himself for speaking to stone. Now it is a thing that will break teeth. He sat and began to write. He wrote in a hand that had become the language of reassurance for a dozen great houses over 2 decades. He said words about patience and about counsel and about waiting to be summoned and about dignity. He wrote to Hoster Tully and to Stannis Baratheon because Robert would not read a letter in the mood he was in. He wrote to the Vale Lords who liked to be told that their opinion mattered. He wrote to those who preferred to be told that the king respected them. He did not write to Ares. He had learned that letters to the mad are spells that rebound upon the caster. Instead, he sent a raven that said, merely, that he had read and understood, and that the Eyrie would not be cause of an avalanche when the mountain already shuddered. Casterly Rock received the tale as it receives all things, by measuring their weight against gold and against the rock's own self-regard. Tywin sat on a chair made of little lions and silence. He let the words be read to him by a man whose voice never cracked. He did not ask for any to be repeated. He did not snort or grimace or bite. When the reader had finished, Tywin nodded and dismissed him and sat looking at light slanting through a slit of a window as if it were something he could buy if only he could discover who owned it. Cersei came in, a green ribbon at her throat, watchful, and bent to kiss his cheek with the calculation of a child who believes love is a ledger. Jaime was not there. He was in the city, already wrapped in white. Tywin thought of this and did not think of it and rose and went to the window. He rarely spoke to himself, but he did then, a single word. Folly, he said, and the rock seemed to agree without caring. In the Red Keep, the queen moved through rooms her husband had made poisonous with his breath. Rhaegar wore dignity like a cloak that had once been trimmed with fur and had since been trimmed down again until it was almost cloth. She listened when ladies murmured the newest version of the tale of the prince and the wolf girl, and she smiled when politeness was called for, and she did not pretend to be deaf when someone's envy made them stumble. Aegon the Conqueror had 2 wives, a lady said to her, braver in company than she would have been alone. And the Faith eventually remembered how to speak to him without spitting. Perhaps it will be so again. Aegon was a conqueror, Rhaegar said, not unkindly. Conquerors write their own liturgy. She dismissed the lady with a look and went instead to find Elia. The Princess of Dorne looked up when the queen entered and rose, though slowly. There were cushions at her back. There was a fan that a handmaid moved with great care. Not because the air was so very hot, but because it might stir a fly, and Elia did not like the idea of killing anything larger than the spiders they found upon the rushes. She smiled at the queen with a curve of her mouth that had not quite enough energy in it to be mischief and was not entirely resignation. A little girl with dark hair, Rhaenys, knelt on the floor with a kitten, speaking earnestly to it in a language shared between children and small creatures. "My dear," Rhaegar said. "My queen," Elia said, and if there was a flinch hidden in the word, she hid it well. "The ravens have been busy. If I had not known it from the servants, I would have known it from the way the doves preened themselves, as if making themselves look smarter might protect them from gossip." Rhaegar sat and took her hands as if she were her own daughter. "I will not pretend to you," she said. "I do not know yet what it will cost. I know only that our lives cannot be built any longer upon pretending that my son is one man when he is 2. Elia's lashes lowered. "He is many," she said, and there was more ripeness than bitterness in it. "He has always been many. It is part of why I loved him as far as my strength allowed. He has a tenderness that makes men bored and a stubbornness that makes them angry and a gravity that gives them somewhere to stand. He has judged me kindly." She looked down at Rhaenys, who was holding the kitten as if conducting a court. "The realm will be cruel where I would prefer it gentle. I would prefer not to die for other people's stories, my queen." "You shall not," Rhaegar said, and then, because she had learned the shape of truth, "or if you do, let it be by the slow deaths that old age keeps in its cupboard rather than by any suddenness that can be sung about. I will use what power I have left to see that it is so." Elia smiled and meant it. "That is more comfort than I expected this morning," she said. "Thank you. Will you see him when he comes?" Rhaegar asked. Elia considered it not for show. "Yes," she said. "There are words a woman deserves to say to the man who has changed the weather. If he has left his harp behind on purpose, I will suspect him of cowardice. And if he brings it, I will forgive him for that small part of himself that cannot stop singing even in a storm. Varys came, as he always did, as if by osmosis, the air coalescing into the shape of a man unthreatening and thorough. He entered the solar where the Hand, a mild man with careful hands, sat drafting yet another proclamation that could neither please the king nor protect the city. News, Varys said, and the Hand sighed because news had lately become the shadow of a knife at O.N.A. store. The prince is a day out. His household is not overly burdened with men who love loud solutions. The wolves come tethered to law by a father's hand. The small folk along the road have a taste for romance when romance does not cost them bread. The faith? The Hand asked. He was not good at questions that concerned swords. The most devout are in a snit, Varys said, making the thing sound like a puddle in a pigpen and not a torrent on a mountain. The High Septon has doubled the number of candles he lights and halved the number of men he sees. Both are signs of alarm. Some of the zealots would love a riot. It is the sort of thing that gives meaning to their afternoons. But the gold cloaks will stand unless asked to stand somewhere a coin offers them a softer place to rest. The Hand rubbed his temples. We cannot afford a riot, he said. We can never afford a riot, and yet the city likes them the way children like sweetmeats. If the king will only, if his grace will only. He trailed off. They had both learned to trail off rather than finish such sentences. To finish them was to call down the notice of a god no one had invited. Perhaps His Highness will sing in the hall and the people will cry and the king will forget that we are all made of tinder, Varys suggested, not because he believed it but because he collected possibilities the way a housewife collects buttons. Men are foolish, Lord Hand, but sometimes they are foolish in a direction that saves the moment without saving the world. One must be grateful for such crumbs. The gates of King's Landing looked like an apology. Too low, too plain, too worn, as if to say the city had never intended to be a home to kings and had been cowed into it by history. Rhaegar rode beneath them without ceremony and without the bright devices he might once have worn. He had washed. That small fact mattered, though it should not. He had slept some and eaten badly, and he carried a tiredness that did not yet declare itself to be permanent. Lyanna entered beside him and was met by a sound like heat. The low, constant murmur of a city that never stops making small bargains with itself. The smell was a slap, as all cities are at first. The stew of tanners and sweat and horses and onions and the sweet rot of river. The streets were narrower than any northern town would have tolerated and the stones slick with things you would not want to know the names of. Children ran alongside and called out things that made their mothers cuff them on the ear and laugh behind their hands. They rode to the Red Keep, where the stone is red because it remembers. Rhaegar dismounted and handed his reins to a boy whose ears were too large for his head. He set his palm briefly to the boy's hair in a gesture that surprised the boy and made the boy's mother, somewhere out of sight, decide not to go to bed angry with the world that night. He turned and looked up at the keep and breathed as if he were about to go underwater. Arthur Dayne set his palm very lightly to the prince's shoulder. It was not a touch men saw. Rhaegar nodded once. They went in. The great hall had dressed itself. Silk had been hung where stone would have been sufficient. Cushions lay where benches would once have served. Aerys sat upon his throne of blades with his hair loose and his nails clean and his eyes red as if from weeping or from smoke. Behind him stood men as white as vows. To the side sat the queen, composed, and the princess, paler than she had been in years past but not frail before company. The Hand and the court arranged themselves in that careful array by which men give shape to days that will go badly whatever they do. When he saw his son Aerys lifted his chin and smiled a smile that could have been a grin in a kinder man. "You have brought your mistress into my house," he said, almost conversationally. "Do you wish me to show her to the kitchens where we keep the knives? It would save time." Rhaegar did not bow as deeply as he once would have done. He bowed enough. "Your Grace," he said, "I have brought my wife to the house where the realm's law is kept. I brought her so that no man may say I hid her in a grove and expected the leaves to protect her from the wind. If the law will not see her as I have made her, then let the law show itself for what it has become." There was a sort of still laughter the kind that happens under rib cages where no one can see it. The king tilted his head. "You are not yet king," he said. "When you are, you may invent laws to please your harp. Until then you will sit when I tell you to sit, and you will kneel when I tell you to kneel, and you will bring me the men who insulted me and knelt to you. Where is the wolf's father? Where is the wolf who shouted in my hall? I will have them. I will have them now." "They have ridden," Rhaegar said. "They will come when summoned, as is proper. We rode ahead because I would not have the city think that what I have done is a thing to be crept in with under cover of night." "You think of the city," Aerys mused, "the way a gardener thinks of a bed of herbs. I think of it as a fire I can feed. The city is full of men who burn easily," Varys said gently from his place, as if discussing the weather, "and of women who do not burn at all but break, which is in its way worse." Aerys flicked his fingers at him as one flicks at a moth. "Be silent," he said, and Varys was, having been insulted worse by men with less poetry in their cruelty. The king leaned forward. "You will bring them to me when they come," he said to his son, "and you will watch while I make examples of them so that the faith will remember that it is a priesthood and not a government, and so that northern men will remember that their trees cannot eat kings." Rhaegar looked toward the queen's dais. Elaya's gaze met his without flinching. Riella's mouth did something very small and very steady. He looked back to his father and said, "If the law is to be served, let it be served openly. Let there be a court called, with record, with the faith present, and with lords to watch. Let the northern words be heard. Let us not do this in your solar with the door barred and a pot of flame beneath it." Aerys laughed. It was a high sound that some men found contagious. No one laughed with him. "Oh, you always wanted a stage," he said. "Very well. Let this be done with candles and with a clerk. I will have their words, and then I will have their tongues." Lyanna stood without moving. She had been told by Eddard long ago when they were small that there are times when the correct thing to do in a hall is to become furniture, to be there so that others must walk around you but not to draw attention to the fact. She did not speak. She did not lower her head. She let the weight of being seen sit upon her, and it did not crush her because she had already carried worse weights in her own mind. She felt eyes like hands and hands like judgments. She thought of the wooden bowl in Winterfell in which her mother had kept seeds, small hard promises of future color, and she thought, "If I am a seed, let me not be boiled before I am planted." He came to her later, when the hall had exhaled its courtiers and found smaller rooms to vent its discontents. He came to the chamber Rhaella had given her, which was not small but had been made small by the presence of care. The queen had sent not ladies who titter but women who know how to lace a bodice without making a prisoner of the girl inside it. They withdrew when Rhaegar entered, without ceremony but with a glance at Lyanna that said, "We are near." He shut the door and leaned against it for a moment as if to feel the heartbeat of the keep through his back. "He will make a spectacle," he said. "He will take joy in it. He has so few places where joy will still speak to him that he uses this one until it is hoarse." "Will you let him?" Lyanna asked. "If I prevent him, I begin the war with my own hand," he said. "If I permit him, I abandon men to his cruelty to buy time the way a bad gambler buys another hand. There is a sort of shame that belongs to princes like a family coat." He looked at her then, straight on. "Do you wish to leave? I can put you on a ship tonight. The north has ports. You would not be comfortable, but you would be less endangered than you are here." Lyanna smiled without mirth. "And what would you do then? Call me stolen like a coward? No. I am not a thing that can be moved to spare a man his mind. We made a choice in front of trees older than both of us. If I run now, I take back a part of that choice and turn it into fear. Better to stand until the standing is done." He closed his eyes, as a man listening for a note he has nearly found. "Very well," he said. "Then we stand." On the morrow the hands men sent word into the city, by criers in plain coats and by lean boys with bright voices, that the king would hear a matter concerning the honor of a house and the peace of the realm. People came, because people always come when honor is to be dressed in public, and because they wished to see if the prince's face would change when he was made to look upon the man whose daughter he had married without asking the Seven's leave. The hall filled early. The High Septon came in with the measured waddle of a man who knows all eyes weigh him and who does not trust any floor not to be oiled treachery. Behind him the most devout arranged their faces into a collective expression that conveyed sorrow edged with appetite. Lords took their places. Men of the city crowded the back, the smell of them like damp dogs in a storm. Rhaegar entered with the queen and the princess and the king's guard at their stations. He thought of Maegor and of Aegon and of the century between, a line of men like a song that had been modulated several times until the original key was far behind. He thought, "We live in our keys, we rarely hear the old song as it was." A stir near the door. 2 men were brought in. Brandon wore anger the way other men wear a cloak, and his eyes searched the hall for a fight to fit them. Rhaegar had the stern look of a man who had once seen a river freeze and had taught his sons that there are 2 sensible things to be done about it. You wait or you fetch an axe. They stood side by side, bound with little more than the attention of a dozen guards who would not have been able to hold them if they had truly wished to break the lines. The city looked, and the looking did not make them smaller. The hand spoke words about order. The High Septon drooped and tried to make his droop holy. A scribe wet his pen and looked like a heron. The king licked his lips. "Brandon Stark," he said, "you came into my hall and challenged a man to come out and die. You made noises fit for the yard and not the king's house. Do you deny it?" Brandon lifted his chin. "I deny nothing I have done," he said. "I deny the right by which you ask. The law that serves kings is not supposed to be a leash you pull when a man tells you he thinks you are mad." There was a sound across the hall, a little shifting like a flock preparing to take wing. Aerys's fingers clamped on the arm of his throne. "The law is what I say it is," he said, "and it now says that you shall answer for the insult to me and for the theft of your sister's honor." Lyanna felt the moment as if it had been a stone thrown at glass. She did not look to see whether anyone looked at her. She kept her eyes upon the door behind which someone had long ago taught her to step with the ball of the foot first and then the heel. Rhaegar spoke, his voice even and the north in it. "We will not allow you to call theft what was not theft," he said. "We will allow you to call folly what was folly, and law what can be law. We will not permit you to make a word into a knife because you are bored with your old knives." The High Septon harumphed. He believed words to be knives when in his hand. He did not like the thought of other men holding them. "The marriage," he began, swelling himself like a bullfrog, "was performed without sanction. The 7 do not acknowledge such. The 7 acknowledged it when the Undulls bent knee to a conqueror who had 2 wives," Rhaegar said, so mild one could have buttered bread with the tone. "Or do you deny that your God has memory? We are not in the age of the conquest," a most devout snapped, eager for the part where cleverness scores points like lances. "We are civilized. We are in the age we are in," Rhaegar said, and the hall turned to him gratefully, because everyone had wanted him to speak. "The question is what we are willing to be civilized about. If we are civilized about law, then let law proceed. If we are civilized about mercy, then let mercy. But if we are civilized only about gossip and about the soft furnishings of religion, then we deserve the next winter." Aerys lost patience with the shaping of the day. He slapped the arm of the throne. "Enough," he said, and the word went like a bell rung too hard. "I am the king. You will have justice. Brandon Stark, you will answer me. Did you call out your prince? Did you threaten your king's peace?" Brandon's mouth opened. Rhaegar saw the words forming and saw the way they would strike the hall like a stray spark in dry hay. He stepped forward before Brandon could speak. "He called out theft and I answered with truth," he said. "Any man who would defend his sister's honor must be given more room than other men." He spoke too loudly. His voice had a blade in it. "So does mine now. Punish him if punishment is called for. But do not pretend he acted in a vacuum. He responded to my act. If there is a debt to be paid, I begin the line." There was a stillness and then something like admiration, not for the content, but for the shape of it, the way a man steps forward to take the blow others think they see. Aerys smiled, and the smile was very tired. "How noble," he said. "He will not die today, not yet. Bring me the Father's judgment. Lord Rhaegar, what do you say of your daughter's honor and of your son's rage and of this prince who stands like a shield?" Rhaegar looked up at the ceiling as if seeking a crack to count and then straight at the king. "I say that you are not a fit judge for this," he said. "If the realm is to be bound by your ruling, let the realm see which hand has tied the knot. I ask for a great council." The words dropped like a stone into deep water. Even those who had never seen such a thing pictured chains of ravens loosed into the sky and lords in their colors crossing hills like patches on a quilt drawn aside to let in sun. Aerys laughed, and it sounded like a cough. "A council to decide whether my son is a whoremonger and a traitor?" he asked. "A council of chattering geese to tell me whether a wolf is a dog?"
"No."
"It is the law that the realm may call a council when succession is in question," Rhaegar said, unruffled. "The law has never forbidden lesser uses. We do not know what succession will be if your grace refuses to hear reason, or if your grace's health declines further. I ask for the peace of a large room, rather than the heat of a small one." Aerys stood. He was not tall. He made himself taller with rage. "You ask to defy me," he said. "You ask to make my throne into a stool for monks. You ask me to sit while women and milk lords decide whether my house is to be mocked." He turned, sudden as a scythe swing, to the Kingsguard. "Gerald, Barristan, make them quiet. Make them wait. Bring me wood and iron." Barristan moved, for duty, for law, for the terrible economy by which men spend their honor to buy a little safety for others. Gerald Hightower moved because he had spent his life moving when kings told him to, and because his bones knew this motion better than they knew sleep. Arthur Dayne did not move. He looked at Rhaegar, and in that look was an entire conversation without a single word. "Now? Not yet. Now? Not yet. If we wait, we will be made complicit in a thing we cannot redress. If we act, we call down war that may devour men like wheat." And then the hall, being a hall and not a god, made a decision for them because it began to fill with smoke. Not much. Not the dreadful stench that says fire has taken hold. Only the ghost of smoke, the breath of it from some brazier appended in the antechamber by a careless servant or by a careless god. Men tensed. Aerys's eyes went large as if they would split. "Wildfire," he whispered, the word like a lover's name in a madman's mouth. "Do you smell it? Do you smell her? She is with us." He looked around wildly and found, because he always did, someone to hate. "They have come to burn me," he said, almost delighted. "They have brought their cold northern fire to finish what they began with their spitting." "It is a brazier, your grace," the hand said, the words mild like milk offered to a man who wants wine. "The servants." "Let it be doused," Rhaegar said, and his voice was iron hammered thin. "No fire in the hall. Not today." The command rode ahead of him, obeyed because it was a command in a room suddenly full of men who wanted a thing to do that could be done without thinking about law. The smoke thinned, the moment eased, but it did not go away. Things had been named in it that would not be unnamed. In the lull, Barristan Selmy judged and found that the weight could be shifted from one side of the scale to the other without breaking it. He spoke in a voice meant to soothe horses. "Your Grace," he said, "let Lord Rhaegar and Lord Brandon be held in comfort, not as felons. Let the court reconvene on the morrow with the faith present and the lords duly summoned who can be summoned. Let all see you be not only king but justice. Let them see you generous in the face of insult. It will serve you better than haste." Aerys stared at him, suspicion a living thing in his gaze. It unfurled and looked around the hall for someone else to bite. It found Varys and let go of Barristan like a snake slipping off a warm rock. "Do you sing to me like my son now, dog?" he asked. "Very well. Comfort. Bring them comfort. Bring them cushions. Bring them meat. Bring them wine. Bring them everything but release. And build for me a thing of iron. Build for me a thing of fire. I will be comforted when I see smoke come out of a man's mouth who has lied in my hall." He sat down again so abruptly the throne's points made him wince. The wince made him angry. The anger made him smile. They were led away. Brandon's stride so large it made a mockery of his escort's attempts to make him look contained. Rhaegar did not look left or right. He counted doorways. He found them all. The hall broke apart and reassembled itself into rumor and recollection. The High Septon dabbed at his brow and told himself that he had been very brave. The most devout promised themselves better seats for the next day. The small folk poured into wine shops and into corners with their cups to make the story sensible by making it obscene. The hand went to his room and vomited neatly into a basin, and then called for stronger wine than his wife liked him to drink. Varys drifted along corridors like a man who had misplaced a trinket and was pleasantly surprised to discover as he searched that he had dropped it somewhere interesting. In a garden where oranges would have been ridiculous but where, through some perverse insistence, there was a tree that would bear a few every summer, Elia sat and waited. Rhaegar came to her, alone. He sat on the low wall and looked at his hands and then at her. The kitten came and batted at the fringe of his sleeve, and Rhaenys chased it and nearly upended her mother's cup, and then made a face at both adults and darted off into safe mischief, attended by a maid who had the reflexes of a hawk. "I am sorry," he said. "It is a poor beginning for most conversations." For once it was the only one that would do. "For what?" Elia asked, not sharply. "For being the sort of man who thinks the world can be tuned? For being right as often as you are wrong and wrong as often as you are right? For the taste you put in my mouth every time the court looks at me and tries to decide whether pity is a kind of courtesy?" She smiled. "Say sorry for the things you can fix, Rhaegar. The rest are prayers, and I have learned I do not like to waste breath that way." He looked at her with the particular shade of love that men reserve for women who have seen them clearly and have not delighted in it. "I will not let the king use you to punish me," he said. "He will try to use me to punish me," Elia said dryly. "It is his way. Live long enough with a man like that and you learn the shape of his cruelty the way a fisherman learns the weather." She set her hand upon his wrist. "You have brought the North into our house. Very well. Then make it worth the draft they bring in under our doors. Make it not only a matter of love, but of law. Make it not only a matter of law, but of mercy. If you can do those things, I will forgive you for the rest." He bowed his head over her hand and did not weep, and in not weeping did something more difficult. When he rose to go, she said, "If I cannot come to the hall tomorrow, do not mistake it for cowardice. There are limits to what a body can do even when a spirit is willing." He nodded. She watched him leave and sat very still until the sun had shifted just enough to make the shadow of the orange leaves run like ink across her skirt. She pressed her palm to her belly and spoke a single word into the air that was not a prayer but a vow no gods could keep for her. Night came to the Red Keep carrying all the whispers that the day had made and all those the night makes on its own. Rats went about their brisk, honest business. Men with knives practiced a different honesty. The moon laid a pale cloth upon the city and watched men stain it anyway. On the city walls a watchman stamped his feet and told himself he preferred the smell of river to the smell of blood, which might have been true if he had ever had a choice. The king slept in fits and starts and once woke and tried to stand and found that fear had made his legs strangers. He sat and called for wine and for a girl who would remind him that he was still desired by something other than madness. The girl came and did her duty and afterward was sick in a courtyard and went to her sister and said, quietly, that there are some stories that even a life as small as hers must refuse to carry. Rhaegar stood at a window with Arthur Dane beside him and looked down at the city that had been the setting of his childhood. If I could cut it away from the river and let it drift out to sea, would the realm be better? He asked, not expecting an answer. Arthur grunted, an inelegant sound that in his mouth became honest. It would drown, he said. So would the men who do not deserve drowning. Things are not as tidy as songs. Not even mine, Rhaegar said. Tomorrow. Tomorrow, Arthur echoed. He did not say any of the things a man might say to a prince the night before a day that could begin a war. He did not tell him to be careful. He did not tell him to be brave. He did not tell him to be politic. He had discovered that men in the moments before the heavy parts of their lives begin do not need instruction. They need company. Morning brought with it a sky the color of old pewter and a wind that had sharpened itself on the bay. The hall filled again, obedient to hunger, for justice, for spectacle, for bread. Lyanna stood where she had been told to stand, and though she did not like being told anything by men who spoke as if their words had been blessed, she stood because a body is sometimes a kind of argument, and she had learned the value of arguments that do not speak. Rhaegar took her place, and a woman too rose behind her, who had told herself she would hate the Stark girl on principle, found herself watching the queen instead and thinking that dignity is a terrible burden to die under. Elia did not come. Her chair sat empty and made a statement and refused to elaborate. Rhaegar and Brandon were brought, not in chains, because the hand had remembered the value of optics and because Rhaegar's face the night before had made men reconsider the speed with which they wished to watch wolves muzzled. Aerys came last, as kings do. He carried the air with him like a pestilence. He did not sit. He stood in front of the throne and spread his hands as if showing that he concealed no blades. "My lords," he said, and the oily majesty of his voice made old men remember why he had once been loved. "You come to see whether your king has forgotten the law. See now how well I remember." He gestured, and men came forward with things they had built in the night. A framework of iron, a brazier, a device whose purpose men might have denied if asked at supper. The city, which has seen all instruments of cruelty and has given each of them a nickname, drew breath as one. Rhaegar stepped before the men carrying iron. He did not touch the apparatus. He put himself between it and the space in which men stand when they are begging. "No," he said. The word made the hall smaller. The word made the city stop for a heartbeat and consider whether it had heard what it had heard. The king's guard shifted without seeming to. Gerald Hightower's eyes went to the king's face. Barristan's hand went near his hilt and then away, as if to remind himself that there are gestures that cannot be taken back by memory. Arthur Dane's fingers flexed very slightly. Oswell went, who had always liked jokes a little too much for the comfort of his own soul, stopped smiling. Aerys's face changed in a way that was almost beautiful, like frost forming upon glass. "No," he said. "You tell your king no? Shall we vote, then? Shall we make a list of groceries for the throne to bring home from market?" "No." Rhaegar did not move. "My lord father," he said, and the softness of the phrase held a steel no one had heard from him in public before. "If you do this, you begin a war. If you administer law, I will stand with you in law, even when it is cruel. If you do this, I will stand between you and the thing you think you want." "Between me," Aerys said very quietly, "and fire. Between you and the ruin of your house," Rhaegar said, and at that the hall remembered to breathe. Aerys's gaze went to the faith, as if to seek refuge there. The High Septon dabbed, already composing how he might recall this day if asked under a friendly roof with wine in him. The most devout looked like men deciding how to price their virtue. He looked to the lords. Some lowered their eyes. Some, more honest, did not. He looked to Varys, who had hands steepled in front of him like a man hearing a confession. He looked to the queen and found no shelter there. He looked past Elia's empty chair and found in its emptiness an insult which he could name and punish, unlike the others, which baffled him because they were complicated. "Very well," he said lightly, as a man might say upon discovering that the exact food he had wanted at supper was not available. "Let us have a trial by combat." The words were not expected. They ran through the hall like rats through a granary. Ricard's head turned as if following a sound that only he could hear. Brandon hefted his shoulders and grinned a grin that did not know whether it was for relief or for delight in the chance finally to aim his rage at something with edges. "Your Grace," the hand began delicately, "such things are not customarily. Customs are habits," Aerys said. "I have kicked the habit of sleep. I can kick others. Lord Ricard, you will champion your house's honor. Choose your foe." Ricard looked at the men in white and then at the men in silks and then at the men in plain coats who had come because their lives were affected by the ways great men conducted themselves. He spoke with the same mildness as before. "The law says the accused names his champion. he said. "We are not accused of theft. We are accused of contempt. If contempt is a crime that can be tried by combat, then it must be tried fairly." Ares's smile sharpened. "Then I name your foe," he said, "and I name fire. Let us see if your northern gods protect you as well in heat as they do in snow. We will bind you in your armor as you are always binding me in your words, and we will see whether your pride burns hotter than iron." He gestured to Brandon without looking. "And you, boy, since you love your father so much, let us see if love can pull a man free from his own folly. We will put a cord around your neck and you will be permitted to try to reach and release him as he cooks. It will be a song, will it not, my son?" he asked Rhaegar pleasantly. "A good song? A true song." The hall did not make a sound. Even the city beyond seemed to lean in and hold its breath, as if the river had taken a moment to go still to hear whether men would choose madness openly rather than in the privacy of their beds. "No," Rhaegar said again, and this time the word did not sound like a harp string. It sounded like a doorbell set. He took one step and then another, and the white cloaks might have moved to stop him if the shame of so doing had not clung to their hands like honey. He stood in front of his father and put his palms out as if begging alms and said, "I call great council." Ares's smile broke like thin glass. "You have no right," he hissed. "I have the right of the realm," Rhaegar said. "I have the right of the people who will eat what you feed them out of fear. I have the right of the dead from the last time we let your fear be the law." His voice rose enough to fill the room and the part of the city that lay just outside the windows. "I call bannermen to assemble and lords to bring their oaths with them, and I call on the faith to counsel, and I call on law that is older than any one man's madness. I call upon the memory of Aegon the Conqueror who made this throne, not so that sons might be murdered in halls for sport, but so that men might bow once instead of 100 times. I call great council, and if you deny it, you deny the order you claim to love." He did not look at the High Septon, but the High Septon sat up and remembered that sometimes being holy means being stubborn in front of power when it matters. "The faith," he said, his voice plump with sudden courage, "acknowledges the propriety of counsel when the realm is disordered. The faith's hand will be upon the seal." Ares spun toward him, the motion a slash. "You fat," he began, and then checked himself, because rage had too many targets and he could not strike them all at once. He went back to the safer hatred. "Kingsguard," he said very softly. "Seize the prince." The hall held its breath a second time. It is not given to halls to hold more than 2 breaths at once. After that, they begin to break apart from the pressure. Gerald Hightower did not move. Barristan Selmy did not move. Arthur Dane very slightly shifted his weight to the balls of his feet. Varys took in a breath as if to speak and then did not. He had seen great acts made small by the wrong words. He had seen small acts made great by silence. This time he chose the latter. The hand sat perfectly still and thought, "If I stand now, I will be killed." He also thought, "If I do not stand now, I will be killed differently later." He chose cowardice and told himself it was prudence. Many men have done so and lived. He did not know yet whether he would be one of them. It was Barristan who moved first, but not in the way Ares had commanded him to. He took a single step and dropped to one knee between the king and the prince, the gesture so smooth it might have been mistaken for a rehearsed thing. His head was bowed. "Your Grace," he said, "if the prince is to be seized, then let it be by law, not by anger. If the prince is to be judged, let it be by the realm that loves you. You will be seen to be merciful and strong. Let us not give your enemies a story they can tell in dark rooms that will grow teeth." Gerald followed, slower because he was older and because pride in a spine resists bending once it has learned not to. He knelt. The old man's knees cracked audibly in the silence. He said nothing. His white hair told a story that his mouth had no wish to put into words. Arthur Dane did not kneel. He stood by Rhaegar's shoulder and was a sword without being drawn. He looked at Ares and did not look away. In that look was a lifetime's oath held in his hands, weighing it against a single man's madness. Ares's mouth worked. He had underestimated how treachery might look when worn by men who had never worn it before. He had expected it to look sordid. It looked sad. He faltered. "Very well," he said through his teeth. "Very well, very well, very well. Great counsel. Send your ravens. Call your sheep. Bind your wolves in words. And you," he jabbed a finger at Ricard and Brandon, "you will be kept comfortably, so that your comfort gnaws you like rats while you wait for the sound of hooves and the taste of your own folly." Rhaegar did not permit himself the luxury of relief. He turned to the hand. "Your lordship," he said, "draw the writ. The faith will co-seal. The lords will be summoned to the dragon pit within a fortnight. The city will see that its king is advised by men who wish him well." The hand stood and bowed and was already composing the document in his head. How he might place words so that they could be read two ways and each way offer cover to a different kind of cowardice. Varys flowed out of the hall and along corridors and began to arrange for ravens to be fattened with the seeds of exactly the story that would draw men who wished to be at the center of something that would be sung. The small folk spilled out of the hall and into the streets and then into their lives, which are made of bread and bone and the occasional piece of bright ribbon, and told each other that kings had nearly fought inside a room and that wights who were not ghosts had knelt before men in colors. They made up the rest as they always do. Some of what they made up was truer than what the lords would write. Lyanna sat very still until the city's noise became a part of her again. She rose and left the hall without waiting for permission and found Eddard with his back against a pillar counting the spaces between his breaths. He looked at her and his face softened like wax in hands. "You did not speak," he said. "It was not an accusation." "There was nothing I could say that would not be used like a stone," she said. "There will be time for words when men have remembered they are not fires." Outside, the sky had not made up its mind whether to rain. The wind off the bay smelled of salt and of tar and of the fish that have fed this city for centuries and will feed it when all its names have been forgotten. The bells of the September rang, either for a service or because a septon had decided the day needed to be reminded that God exists. The ravens went up from their towers like the thoughts of a man unable to sleep. On the river, a barge laden with barrels moved with all the dignity of an old fat man in a bathtub. On the walls, boys of 15 compared knives and told one another that if war came they would run toward it, as boys have told themselves since the first time two villages found one path narrower than either had desired it to be. In a chamber where the light found him like a thief, Rhaegar sat and put his harp upon his knees and did not play. He listened to the city and to the sea and to the sound of his own breath and decided that he would not let this day stand alone. He would write to Tywin Lannister and to Jon Arryn and to Hoster Tully and to men who enjoyed being written to because it made them feel taller. He would write to Doran Martell and use words that could be forgiven even if they could not be loved. He would send to the north and ask that Winterfell lend its chill to a room where heat had lately been too popular. He would write a song when he had done all the writing that mattered to law. He would not sing it in public. He would keep it for a winter night when children were asleep and a woman he had asked too much of could listen without having to carry the weight of its notes into the next morning. The city did what cities do when told a storm is coming but given a day or two before its first lash. It held a market. It argued about price. It found a bed in which to fuck in the afternoon. It beat a man for theft and then gave him a heel of bread because pity is cheap in the short term and expensive in the long. It told stories about how dragons are not what they were and wolves are not what they were and neither are men and that maybe that was good, or maybe it was the end of all things in a different costume. It waited. On the Isle of Faces the Green Men, if such creatures exist and not merely in the frightened imaginations of children and of knights who drink too much before a vigil, stood among the white trunks and felt the vibration of a call going out across the realm. They do not speak to men, and men do not hear them when they do, but if anyone had been listening there, he might have noticed a shift in the slow breathing of the trees, as if some deep old thing had turned in its sleep to face the draft. Branch tree or iron throne, song or law, wolf or dragon. The shapes were in motion now. The ravens took to air in great black strokes. The ink dried on a proclamation that would be copied until the meaning of its words was worn thin by the journey. Men who had thought to spend the next fortnight counting sheep began to think of counting their friends. Women who had thought to spend the next fortnight counting coins began to plan for shortages and for refugee cousins whose timing would be insufferable and unavoidable. boys dreamed of swords. Old men dreamed of winter. Somewhere in the alley behind a little wine shop, a pair of lovers decided to get married before other people's vows made a mockery of theirs. Somewhere in a better house, a lady decided not to, and found herself happier than she expected to be for an hour. When evening came, the prince went to the queen and she to him, and there were no songs, only bread and olives and a dish of stewed lamb that had been cooled and warmed twice that day and tasted of hurry. Rhaegar ate with slow economy. "You have put yourself in front of a storm," she said to her son, as if speaking about the weather and the wash on the line. "If you are still there when it comes, you will be changed. If you move, the storm will talk about you for a century and pretend it blew you where you landed by its own idea. There is less difference between these two outcomes than men like to suppose." "I do not wish to be talked about for a century," he said. "You are a prince," she said gently. "It is not about what you wish." He smiled and looked very young for a heartbeat. "I wished it might be," he said. "Thank you for humoring me when I was a boy. I see now how kind it was." She touched his cheek the way only mothers are permitted. "I do not know if it was kind," she said. "It was a delight." She let her hand fall. "When I married Ares, I believed that marriage is a thing that happens to a woman the way a change in weather does. You have made marriage into a thing that happens because you want it to. It is both better and worse." He did not argue with her. Some truths are not improved by argument. They ate. The lamb was forgiven for its hurry by the company it kept. Lyanna, in her chamber, took down her hair and brushed it because she liked the feeling, and because there are few things in a city that feel like clean wind, and hair well brushed can sometimes be one of them. The woman who had laced her earlier returned with a pot of something that smelled of lavender and of the sort of money that buys lavender. "For sleep," the woman said, offering it without officiousness. Lyanna smiled and took it and did not use it. She lay down without help and listened. The city makes a noise at night like a great many people trying to say the same thing in different ways. It did not soothe and it did not frighten. It insisted. She turned on her side and thought of snow falling on the gods, would pond so quietly you felt you would be punished if you breathed too loudly. She fell asleep in a room where 1,000 choices had been hung like tapestries, and found that even amidst so many choices a person can sometimes feel free. In the stables, a boy with ears too large for his head bedded the prince's gray and told it, without expecting to be understood, that he had touched the prince's sleeve and it had felt like any other fabric. He felt better knowing that. In a tower room, Barristan Selmy slept in armor. He did not trust himself without the weight. In another tower, Arthur Dane sat cross-legged with Dawn across his knees and tried to remember the faces of all the men he had killed so far and could not, which is a kind of sorrow that men like him tell no one. Gerald Hightower wrote a letter to a woman he had not seen in 20 years and did not send it. Varys greased the hinges of a door not because anyone would come through it tonight, but because someone might need to in a week. The hand dreamed of ink. Ares dreamed of green fire and of his own laugh spilling out of a room like oil into a gutter. Beyond the walls, the great roads began to know the tread of messengers and then of lords. In the Riverlands, Hoster Tully called for his daughter and spoke to her without quite looking at her about marriages and about how some men make the world smaller and some make it bigger and how both are dangerous. In the Reach, Mace Tyrell wrote a letter full of fine phrases and sent it, and then immediately wrote another with the opposite sentiment and sent that too, to a different man, and told himself that he was becoming very clever indeed. In Dorne, Doran Martell sat in shadow and considered that patient men who sit long enough get to watch impatient men act, and that this had always been his preference. And then his sister came in and called him 100 kinds of coward in a voice that was almost affectionate. And he told her to sit and eat a fig, and she did, and between them they began to decide whether Elia would be safer in the city or out of it if men began to call honor by the wrong names in public. And in the north, at Winterfell, a raven arrived after 2 days hard flying and found Maester Luwin's predecessors ready for it, and found a hall where old men took off their hats because the wind had followed the letter in, and you cannot make a good decision with your ears stiff with cold. They read and grunted. They looked toward the crypts. They looked toward the weirwood. They looked toward the road. They began to choose. The north is slow to choose. Once it chooses, it is slower to change its mind than stone is to change its face. In King's Landing, the morning after, The city woke early because people always wake early the day after they have convinced themselves that something important will happen. The dragon pit, vast as a memory and half a sound, creaked as men dressed it with banners and with benches and with a dais that tried to look humble and failed. The High Septon practiced a sermon that he would pretend later had come to him in a flash of grace. Varys sent a boy with coins to speak to bakers about delivering bread to certain corners of the city at certain hours because bread matters when men are deciding whether to riot. The Hand met with scribes and told them what to write and what not to hear when shouted at by lords with red faces. Rhaegar broke his fast on pears and hard cheese and stood very long at a window and told himself that men who feel the weight of their lives may yet carry it with some style if not with ease. Lyanna braided her hair back and thought about what words she would say first if anyone demanded speech. She settled upon none. She would speak when the moment came, even if the moment's words made her a fool. Better a fool who chooses than a clever woman who is chosen for. She tied a blue ribbon at her throat. There was a fray in it. She left it. The bells rang again, as they would continue to ring for days. Small iron hearts inside bronze ribs. The city began to move toward the hill where dragons had once slept and were now only stories. The ravens went out, and the ravens came in, and with them came the soft, slow accumulation of a world deciding whether it wished to keep its shape or to make a new one and pay the price. Somewhere in the keep, Ares laughed and coughed. Somewhere else, a young scribe put sand upon a line she had just written and whispered the words aloud because she liked the way they felt and because she wanted to be certain someone had heard them once, just in case they were the ones the realm forgot. And in the long room beneath the look of 100 stone dragons, the space for council filled with men who had been called. They took their places. They shifted. They coughed and composed their faces and arranged their friends nearby and their enemies where they could see them better. They looked up when the prince entered and then sat back when he did not speak immediately because silence has its own theater. They looked at the doorway every time the king did not appear and then looked at one another and tried to make the not appearing into a kind of appearing they could categorize. Rhaegar let the noise swell and sink and then spoke. He did not call the roll of houses or the catalogue of grievances or the list of precedents. He said something smaller and for that reason larger. "We are here to keep winter from eating us," he said. "We can decide whether the words we must use to do so are old or new. We can decide whether love may be law's companion instead of being its enemy. We can decide whether kings may be mad in private and wise in public, or whether we must pretend we do not know the difference. We can decide whether to shame a woman for choosing or to shame men for making it impossible. We can decide 1,000 things, and each of them will make a mark upon the air that our children will breathe. I will not die to prove a song. I will live to prove a law." It was not the speech men wanted. It was the one they would remember when the lists of grievances had become words that scholars trade like coins. The hall listened. The city listened. The realm listened because the realm always listens even when it pretends it does not. Somewhere far to the north, a crow cried. Somewhere far to the south, a desert gave off its heat to the night and shivered and kept its secrets. Between men began to speak.